Hello and welcome to our podcast series, Conversations with KidsPeace. I'm Bob Martin. Millions of years ago, when T-Rex roamed the earth, it was the 1970s and I was in high school. And there I found out about a pastime that was unlike anything I'd ever heard of before. It was a role-playing game in which players took on characters who took on personalities and powers as a result of the roll of dice. And it apparently went on and on and on, days, weeks, sometimes months at a time. Devotees of the game would talk in shorthand, hit points, critical hits, rules as written, 20-sided die, dwarves, elves, wizards, clerics, attributes, etc. All of which made it abundantly clear that this was its own community. And the game, of course, was Dungeons and Dragons. Fast forward 40 years or so, avoiding T-Rex in the process, and D&D, as it's known, is still around. In fact, it's gaining a little bit of a cool vibe, with avid gamers returning to it as the original RPG experience, including a growing list of celebrities like Stephen Colbert, Patton Oswalt, even the ultra-cool Vin Diesel. But recently, we learned of something even more unexpected than the Fast and Furious D&D. Dungeons and Dragons as a therapeutic tool for group sessions with individuals with autism. To tell us about how he's adapted a game he enjoys to address the needs of the kids he sees at KidsPeace, we welcome back to the podcast our good friend, Rob Harvey. Rob is the director of IBHS, that's Intensive Behavioral Health Services, at KidsPeace's community programs in Pennsylvania. Rob, welcome back. It is always good to talk with you, even in a socially distant conversation.
Always a pleasure to be here, Bob.
Excellent, excellent. So for those who are not familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, can you kind of quickly explain the game, or describe the game, I should say, and how it's played?
Sure. Quickly will be difficult, but I will do my best. So Dungeons and Dragons, as you said, came about before I was born, but then I played it with my brothers, and it's a game where, I suppose the closest thing to it is it's a board game, I guess, but there's no set board, there's no set pieces. The adventure is coming out of the mind and imagination of one player who's called the dungeon master or the game master, depending on what version you're playing. And this person puts forth a set of challenges that the group then has to overcome collaboratively. So like you said, each person chooses their own character. And typically it's something very fantasy based, an elf fighter, a dwarf cleric, something like that, where, it's very easy to kind of get lost in the kind of fantasy world and get away from that, that kind of day to day. And largely, the game is determined by dice rolling. So there are, there's the standard 6-sided dice that we're all very accustomed to, but there are 12-sided dice, there are 10-sided dice, there is the very important 20-sided dice, which is really what Dungeons and Dragons is built around. And so, it's a combination of luck and also your, the things that you come up with to do as your character in order to, overcome those challenges. And one game can last years, so it's
funny when you tell people that, and then all of a sudden they're like, I need to see the rule book, and you're kind of like, the dungeon master's going to tell you what to do.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, there is a rule book, but that tells you it gives you kind of a general set of, just kind of principles to go by. But the story is all in the head of the person running the game.
That's wild. So tell me how you came up with the idea of using this in your group therapy sessions.
Sure. So this isn't something that I made up. It's, Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games have been used in therapy for a long time. So I'd kind of heard of it, but really where I landed on it was for years I've been running theater groups for individuals with autism. they're just so successful. The individuals that are in them, and I've had kids as young as, I think 7 or 8 probably is the youngest in those groups, up to, individuals in their 30s and 40s in these at this point. And the way that I've always run these is that each person chooses their character that they're going to play in that theater production. And then I write a script, and they practice it, and then, we have rehearsals, and then they enact this play, typically in person, but most recently we actually did one on Zoom. And these theater groups are so amazing. I've seen these individuals do so wonderful with them, but in my head the whole time I'm thinking, this is perfect, but I need to do something that's improv based. Like, real life is not scripted. Real life is constantly changing and adapting, and, as much as we sometimes wish that we knew what our line was, like, line, please, what do I say?
And that's part of the whole looking for the rule book.
Yes, exactly. Who wouldn't like a rule book on life? But improv is really more like real life, but it's so uncomfortable. Nobody would sign up for an improv group, except for maybe Steve from The Office, or characters like that. I mean, some people do it, but it's terribly scary, improv. And I just kept thinking, like, this is really the next step for these groups, but I can't hit on it. And then it came to me, the game that I'd been playing since I was about 7 years old is improvisational theater. That is what the game is. And so, I spoke to my team at the time, and I said, do we think this is something we could try? Do we think this might work? And they said, well, sure, let's give it a shot. And, so that was kind of how it happened. And it just kind of all fell together, and it's just been perfect since.
Were there particular goals you had when you decided to try this for the group to come out of the game?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. So, the kind of big skills that we're looking at to kind of look at the population that I'm working with, I've worked with individuals with autism of all different abilities, so some that have very limited language, some who have lots and lots of language, but are more inhibited in their ability to, have complex relationships and things like that. So, this intervention was really targeted at individuals who are kind of further along in their journey, and need those kind of higher level social skills, soft skills, people refer to them as, I guess, sometimes. But that ability to really connect to others really, kind of strongly. So the things we look at in order to develop those relationships are things like really strong perspective taking skills, really strong flexibility, really strong social problem solving, the negotiation of, complex social interactions, right? So these are skills that are very difficult to duplicate in a group setting where you're sitting around talking about, what you're going to do this weekend. So, there's all different formats of social skills groups. And that's where the theater piece came in, where they were kind of taking on other perspectives, interacting with other characters, learning about different things. And then that improv piece was to kind of bump that up and put them in these situations. So the beauty of Dungeons and Dragons was that by default, you are playing a different person. You are not yourself, which has two beautiful things to it. One, that, they are right off the bat taking on a different perspective, which is what we want to see. But then two, they're removing themselves from the shame of making a mistake as themselves. So if they screw up this social situation, it's not It's not Rob that just got rejected or Rob that just fell down and everybody's laughing about. It's my character. So, there's a lot of research into this kind of therapeutic role play where you are, you're still facing some, consequences of your actions, but in a removed sense. So I really wanted to capture on that. That was a big one. The perspective taking, the kind of the consequence kind of different social interactions, but also the taking risks and seeing them pay off or seeing them fail, but then trying again. And then the collaborative piece. There are few board games. I know that there are a lot of people out there who are avid board gamers who would scoff at what I'm about to say, but there are few popular board games where you are working together. It's usually, the monopoly of 6 hours later, one person arises as the victor. This is a game where the whole table, if they're either going to win together or they're going to lose together. Right. So I wanted to incorporate that kind of team, kind of aspect, which is social in and of itself. And then, just the fact that it is so reinforcing, so fun. I don't think that you could ever place enough value on how important it is for people to enjoy their therapy, because that's what keeps them coming back. And I can tell you that just that by itself, I have people do not miss this group. Like this, most of the groups I run are like, oh, we run 8 weeks and then we take a break for a month or so. They will not stand with these. They are there every week, come hell or high water. So I mean, that was capturing that motivation was key, so that they are really motivated to engage in this, this amazing group therapy experience.
I'm wondering if you can give me an example of an adjustment that you had to make in the game in order to bring it to your group.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple things come to mind. The first one is that in the current edition of Dungeons and Dragons, so I'll spare you the full history, but we are currently on 5th edition. So, there was, original, and now we're on 5th edition many years later. So in 5th edition, they added this thing called inspiration points. And basically an inspiration point is something that is granted to a player for doing something cool, heroic, funny, whatever. And that allows them a reroll. So on something where they want to do something and they roll poorly, the dungeon master can grant them this reroll, this inspiration point. So I've kind of adopted that. I've gone overboard with that, because anytime I see them, a kid who normally shies away from a social experience, and they're like, "Oh, let me try this." I'm like, you know what? That's awesome. Here's an inspiration point. If it's a kid who normally doesn't work together with another person and they make even the smallest effort to help that other person, hey, take an inspiration point. I've even been known to give out inspiration points in other groups to use in Dungeons and Dragons group. I'm like, hey, what you just did there, right? I'm like, hey, what you just did there, that was really cool. Take an inspiration point for next Monday, right? So, it's almost like a little secret joke between the two of us, but so it's this really cool like token that has some in-game purpose, but also has this group kind of reinforcement ability to it, where everybody sees it happen and they're like, oh, that's something that I should do more, so it's got this cool shaping ability to it. So we started out with a pilot.
I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, I think a lot of folks would just say, hey, we're going to do this. And they'd go, you're going to do what? With what? With who? What? And so how did that go? Like, how did the pilot work out for you?
So Yeah, the pilot was it was amazing, but the actual getting it started, there was a lot of convincing that had to take place. So it wasn't hard to convince my supervisor at the time. She was all on board, so that wasn't difficult at all. But getting the families to understand what exactly it was that I was inviting them to take part in was difficult, because, I even remember I was like, I have to put on the sign-up form, like, this is not a cult. There is no, because there's been this strange association lasting from the 70s and 80s.
Yes, I was going to say that's one of the things that did come to mind when we were talking about it, and I did go back and take a look, and there was a lot of frankly, just nonsense thrown around about it.
Yep.
So, it's interesting that 40 years later, you have to go back and say, by the way, you may have heard this, you may remember this. It's not true. It wasn't true then, and it's not true now.
Right. Yeah. And I think, honestly, I think I was more worried about it than I should have been, because, I've been doing this for a long time, running social skills groups of various kinds for, I can never quite figure out how long it's been, but over 12 years. So the parents, they trust me. They're like, well, this sounds different, but, it's Mr. Rob. So, let's give it a try. So it started out, the pilot was a handful of teenagers. I think there were, 5 or 6 by the end of that summer. Going into that fall, we were up to over 10. There was a time, Bob, and I don't know how familiar you are with the game, but people say, like, oh, never more than like 6 people at my table. 6, 7, 8, that's a really big group. At one point we had 14.
Wow.
Yeah. It was slightly unmanageable, but it worked out. And then, so because we got so big, then we kind of split the group, and then kind of split the group again. So, COVID aside, because it's kind of thrown a wrench in things. But at one point we had just at the Bethlehem site, we were running 4 groups a week. So, it just became this thing that so many people wanted to take part in. And they were hooked. I've done, various kinds of interventions in my time. And never have I seen, until Dungeons and Dragons group, kids acting differently at the end of that group than they were at the beginning of the group. Not like, not like complete turnaround, but like actually like engaging in different behaviors just based on that day. So from week to week, from month to month, and they loved it. And, I would ask the individuals in group before group, none of them had ever played. I think maybe out of, the 30, 40 plus individuals that have been through these groups, maybe 3 or 4 of them had played before. But if you poll them, which I have done after that, say, what's your favorite thing to do? What do you like to do with friends? What's your favorite thing? Dungeons and Dragons. So despite the fact they had no idea what it was before, it quickly became like this just amazing thing to them, which was just so joyful for me, because it has been such a, point of joy in my life. So to be able to help them with their goals and to, build their skills, but also enjoy it, was just, it's just a wonderful thing.
Yeah. I think when we had one of our conversations, you mentioned that about the extraordinary evidence of progress that you saw. And I'm just wondering, do you think that games like Dungeons and Dragons, similar role-playing games, would they have a role, do you see, maybe in other ways in the therapeutic space beyond what you've been using for?
Absolutely. I've done some consultations in our hospital, and I've, helped out at our acute partial. I've seen various, levels of care in our programming at KidsPeace. And I look at just the need for connection as a group that that Dungeons and Dragons could really bring to them, to find joy together, to solve problems together, to have a shared space that doesn't feel like just therapy, which can be draining, can be stigmatizing, unfortunately, which can be any number of things like this. They feel like they're just there playing a game, and to an outside observer, that's what it looks like. But they're building this connection as a table. There's something about the table in Dungeons and Dragons that builds bonds that are unbreakable. And you asked about modifications, and even in the youngest group that I've run, we're playing Dungeons and Dragons, but the rules are just completely different. It's because I'm simplifying it. There's so much math in Dungeons.
Right.
So it kind of pull out that element and, just use one type of dice. And really it's like, you're good at this or you're not good at this. So if you're good at it, you have to roll, you don't have to roll so great. They actually roll 2 dice instead of 1 and they take the higher. That is borrowed from Dungeons and Dragons. But yeah, so there's ways you can adapt this, kind of intervention to any group of people, and it has no age limit. I've done it with my children when they were as young as 5. I've, played it with my father who is 75. So, it's this amazing universal thing that if you can get a person to agree to sit down at the table, they will almost always enjoy it. Which, I'm not going to guarantee it. There are a handful of people I've seen who are like, this just isn't for me. Or some people are just like, well, I'm interested to watch, I don't really want to play. Usually those people come around eventually.
It seemed to me that'd be something that you'd find a lot of people going, let me just see what's going on here and everything. And then 10 minutes into it, they want to be a part of it. It's almost, as you were speaking there, I was thinking, it's almost like a laboratory session to take the things that they've been taught or they've been told about and give them a ride without them realizing that they're actually doing that.
Yes.
They're just playing the game.
100%. And, and I take, we know these individuals really well. So a lot of them have individual therapy with, Ashley Huber is the person who kind of co-runs most of these groups with me. And she works with a lot of these individuals one-on-one outside of the group. So she can, kind of relay to me some things that are going on. And I'm like, okay, I can work that into the game and they'll never know, So things like, even like flirting is terrifying in real life, but in the game, it's kind of funny. But you can kind of try it out and see what your voice sounds like when you're, when you're flirting with somebody, and the repercussions are very, small. Like, what's the worst thing that can happen? We all laugh together at the funny thing that happened. So, it's super cool.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. One thing before we wind up here, I wanted to ask you about, you had told me there was a phenomenon of, let's just say, the game migrating out of the group.
Oh, yeah.
What happened there?
So there is a number of players who once a week just wasn't enough. And so they created their own groups. They went to local comic book stores. So there's, so as a board certified behavior analyst, practicing applied behavior analysis, we're always looking for, skill building, but then generalization of those skills, right? So they're not just doing it in group, they're doing it in the real world. And what better way to show that than them starting their own groups and, just playing out, at school clubs, at comic book stores, with their families, with their friends, running games on Discord. It just became this, it just ballooned. And, it's just amazing how social they can be in the right circumstance. And yeah, it's just fantastic. There's one, can I tell a quick story?
Sure, absolutely.
Great. So this one young man that I worked with in particular, after the group had been going on for some time, and he loved it, and was having so much fun. Before group the one day, I was standing in the lobby, kind of getting things around, getting ready. And this young man's father approached me and he said, this is kind of hard for me to say, but I really need you to know that, my son is a teenager, and, throughout his life, we've never had anything that we connected over. We've never seen eye to eye. We've never had a shared point. Said, but I played Dungeons and Dragons, and now we play Dungeons and Dragons together, and this group gave us that. So that was an unintended, like I had, who knew? Like I didn't even, I wasn't even really a party to their kind of relationship, and it was just so powerful, but that reach that just goes beyond the table, starts at the table, but so quickly goes throughout their whole life.
That is fantastic. Wow, what an inspiration point. You get that, you get an extra role next time, Rob.
Well done, Bob.
Speaking of that, that we end all of our conversations with asking for a life hack. Today we're going to do something special. I want you to give us your favorite Dungeon Master life hack. All
right. That's good. I like that. So here's my life hack. As a Dungeon Master, players are so visual, right? So some people use miniatures to represent. I will not divulge how much money I've spent on miniature Dungeons and Dragons people, but one of the greatest things that I've found is Pinterest to use as a Dungeon Master. And Pinterest is kind of commonly associated with, art projects
or hobbies. Yeah.
Recipes, things like that. Well, it really is just a way to organize graphic material. And so, there are a zillion different pictures of orcs and elves and wizards and castles and anything you could possibly imagine. So I have this just ridiculously huge Pinterest board of quest ideas, of character ideas, of settings, of anything. So there's memes on there and things too, and really anything. But that would be, if you're wondering, like, I just have so many ideas, but I don't know how to organize them. Make yourself a Pinterest board, and you can make subgroups. And then when someone says like, oh, there's somebody sitting in this tavern here, who is it? I'm like, oh, I didn't think of somebody for this. I just pull up a Pinterest board and I'm like, oh, it's this guy. And show them the picture. And it always makes it better when you've got a picture. It's good to have a picture in their head, but there's a lot of that in the game. So anytime you can incorporate, like, this is what the bad guy looks like. Whoa, right? So that would be my life hack is make yourself a nice Pinterest.
We're taking role-playing games, applying it to therapy. Now we take Pinterest, apply it to D&D. We are all about the connections right here.
Yes, absolutely.
Rob Harvey is Director of Intensive Behavioral Health Services for KidsPeace Community Programs in Pennsylvania. Rob, I rolled my 20-sided die, and it came out that you are a dead-on skill monkey at being on our podcast, and you can come back anytime.
I love it.
And we certainly appreciate you being with us. I'm Bob Martin. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to having you join us again for more conversations with KidsPeace. Take care.